In this lesson, we're going to talk about one of the most important events that takes place in the sort of early period of the communist establishment of power within China, and this is the 100 Flowers campaign that was initiated by Mao. So, it was a very interesting initiative that was presented by Mao in 1957, so a few years after we see we see the establishment of communist rule, but still in this early period, the first sort of 10 years or so of the communist establishment within the Chinese system. And the campaign was essentially an encouragement by the Communist Party for people to seek and to speak freely, of the critical aspects that they thought were imbued within the Communist Party itself. So it was more the case that they were encouraged to speak freely about the party, but to also be critical of some of the flaws within the communist system. And in doing so, the 100 Flowers campaign would ultimately give Mao both the information as well as a bit of a broad mandate to introduce what we know to become the anti-rightist campaign. So, on the one hand, Mao was initially very confident in the kind of critiques that were going to be levied by these individuals, the intellectuals within China, with the 100 Flowers campaign, but then in the end, he would ultimately suppress and would purge a number of individuals who he believed were to be right-wing within the party, anti-communist, etc., etc. So, the questions that we're going to ask in this lesson are, what were the motivations for the campaign? Why did Mao think that it would be a good idea to encourage people to speak critically of the Communist Party? What were the actual criticisms that were levied? And how did this cause Mao to respond? What was Mao's response to the 100 Flowers campaign? And how did this response entrench his communist position even further? So beginning with the motivation, there were a number of reasons why Mao wanted to introduce a campaign to openly critique the Communist Party. You might think that this is quite an unusual thing for somebody who is established to be a dictator to actually introduce. Why would you want a dictatorship to encourage the people under which the dictatorship is ruling to actually critique the party, to be critical of what is said? Well, there were a number of different reasons. It wasn't one single instance why. And one of the reasons may have been a genuine insistence that Mao wanted to improve the party. He may have genuinely wanted to see certain improvements be made within the party itself. It was no secret that Mao did not want to see the CCP and the Chinese government become too bureaucratic. He was very critical of that in the earlier stages of the establishment of communist rule, as well as the nationalist party that existed beforehand. And there were also concerns about the stagnation of the economy. While the economy had improved, there were issues relating to the extent to which the economy was going to continue to improve. There was a bit more of a slowdown in terms of economic growth. And as a result, there might have been a genuine insistence where Mao wanted to see where there could be improvements, where they could improve facets of the party and of the government more broadly. So, that's one of the reasons why we may be able to levy some kind of motivation towards Mao. We could say that it was actually Mao's actual genuine insistence he wanted to improve the party. But I think it would be a bit naive to just suggest that that was the only reason. In fact, the 100 Flowers campaign also served to give Mao information as well as a mandate to remove his political enemies. So there could be a certain amount and a certain degree of the fact that he was actually able to find the people who criticized him and to remove them from the party. Mao believed that many within the CCP were not radical nor revolutionary enough to conform to his own ideals about where he wanted to take the party. He called these the right-wing communists or conservative communists. And he believed that they were openly critical of the CCP, and as a result, if they were openly critical of the CCP, others within the party as well that shared some of Mao's similar beliefs would see it as a noble cause to have them removed and purged from political power. So that's why we say that it gives him both the information, he finds out who are actually critical of the CCP, but it also gives him the mandate. Everybody around him would make this similar connection that these people ought to be removed for being, quote, conservative communist or not radical enough or right-wing, etc., etc. Now, another motivation that's quite interesting is actually relating to international concerns and criticisms that were levied by other communist leaders. So you be quite interested to know that this is around the same time as we see the power struggle in the USSR following the death of Joseph Stalin. And the power struggle that follows immediately following the death of Joseph Stalin gives rise to the leader that subsequently follows Stalin, that being Nikita Khrushchev. And during this time, Khrushchev delivered his so-called secret speech. And in this speech, which was delivered in February of 1956, he was overly critical of the cult of personality that had developed around his predecessor, Stalin. And from the perspective of the USSR and from the perspective of Soviet Union internal domestic policy, this was a clear indication that we were seeing a de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. But it also signified to Mao that there ought to be similar developments made within China. If we can suggest that Nikita Khrushchev was very critical of the idea of there being a cult of personality, Mao may have had a similar inclination for himself. He may have believed himself that there ought not to be a cult of personality develop around him. And a way to encourage this would be with the 100 Flowers campaign, to actually allow people to be critical of the Communist Party. So this could be another reason why the 100 Flowers campaign was actually initiated. So given those were some of the motivations that we can think of, you could think of a few others as well. He may have been a bit overconfident in the actual success of the CCP to the extent to which he probably wasn't expecting such criticism to be levied at all. That could be another motivation. Why? What were the actual criticisms that were levied at the Communist Party? Well, so there were plenty of reasons why the campaign began in 1957, and the criticisms that were actually levied were also very varied and very interesting as well. So, for example, intellectuals argued strongly that the regime had failed in its ability to introduce democratic reform, as well as the creation and the initiation and the essential entrenchment of certain fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of expression. So there was this criticism within the Communist Party that there were a lack of democratic proposals and democratic reform. They were also very highly critical of the fact that a number of members of the Communist Party seemed to be living in very luxurious and very upper-class lifestyles compared to that of the ordinary Chinese citizens. Now, if you remember back to when we looked at the 1949 Civil War, the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, we note that the Communist Party managed to attract a lot of the working class and peasantry within China due to the fact that they were seen as and they were presenting themselves as anti the nationalist perspective. They were anti wealth inequality. They wanted to actually implement a number of things, including land reform, as a way of being able to attract the support of the peasantry within the Chinese system, and therefore be able to take over the rest of China more fruitfully. And so if we have a situation where the CCP were actually living in similar kinds of circumstances as the previous administrations, where they essentially were enriching themselves as a result of government corruption and bureaucracy, then this is a criticism that we can clearly levy to the CCP. And Mao's responses to the 100 Flowers campaign was very interesting. So in June 1957, we see some of the responses begin to take shape. He published a speech in the People's Daily, making a declaration that poisonous weeds have grown among the flowers, and he therefore insisted that instead of offering some kind of compromise and to actually hear out the criticisms that are levied, he went on the attack and labelled the criticisms as right-wing attacks. Now, these criticisms that were levied and the fact that he labelled them in such a way gave Mao the mandate to begin an anti-rightist campaign, whereby around, or at least between 400,000 and 700,000 so-called intellectuals who were critical of Mao and the Communist Party within the 100 Flowers campaign were purged from society. They were either sent to the countryside or they were sent to the Laogai system, which we remember from the previous lesson was the sort of labor camp prison network that began to take shape within the Chinese communist state. Or they opted to just commit suicide, which was another option that took place and something that really did happen quite a lot as a result of the anti-rightist campaign. So we can place the 100 Flowers campaign as another example of how it further entrenched the power that Mao had over the rest of the Communist Party and over the rest of the state of China more broadly, because it actually allowed for Mao to essentially gather more information about those who were critical of him and his colleagues, as well as give him the mandate to initiate attacks and purges against these people who were critical of the Communist Party. Now, the next lesson, we're going to talk about a final instance where we see the establishment of communist rule within China, and this is with regards to the international position of China, and this will be the Chinese intervention within the Korean War in the early 1950s.